over them as she had travelled on leaving the Conza, Mrs. Weldon would only have a little fatigue to fear. Besides, it would be to Alves's interest, for he was in the affair, for the prisoners to arrive safe and sound. The conditions being thus settled, Mrs. Weldon wrote to her husband, leaving to Negoro the care of passing himself off as a devoted servant who had escaped from the natives. Negoro took the letter, which did not allow James Weldon to hesitate about following him as far as Mossames, and the next day, escorted by 20 blacks, he travelled toward the north. Why did he take that direction? Was it, then, Negoro's intention to embark on one of the vessels which frequent the mouths of the Congo, and thus avoid the Portuguese stations, as well as the penitentiaries in which he had been an involuntary guest? It was probable. At least, that was the reason he gave Alves. After his departure, Mrs. Weldon must try to arrange her existence in such a manner as to pass the time of her sojourn at Casound as happily as possible. Under the most favourable circumstances, it would last 3 or 4 months. Negoro's going and returning would require at least that time. Mrs. Weldon's intention was not to leave the factory. Her child, Cousin Benedict, and she were comparatively safe there. Halima's good care softened the severity of this sequestration a little. Besides, it was probable that the trader would not permit her to leave the establishment. The great premium that the prisoner's ransom would procure him made it well worth while to guard her carefully. It was even fortunate that Alves was not obliged to leave Casound to visit his 2 other factories of Bih and Cassange. Coimbra was going to take his place in the expedition on new razzias or raids. There was no motive for regretting the presence of that drunkard. Above all, Negoro, before setting out, had given Alves the most urgent commands in regard to Mrs. Weldon. It was necessary to watch her closely. They did not know what had become of Hercules. If he had not perished in that dreadful province of Casound, perhaps he would attempt to get near the prisoner and snatch her from Alves's hands. The trader perfectly understood a situation which ciphered itself out by a good number of dollars. He would answer for Mrs. Weldon as for his own body. Their occupations included preparing rice with heavy blows of the pestle in wooden mortars, to perfect decortication, cleansing and winnowing maize, and all the manipulations necessary to draw from it a granulous substance which serves to compose that pottage called mtl in the country, the harvesting of the sorgo, a kind of large millet, the ripening of which had just been solemnly celebrated at this time, the extraction of that fragrant oil from the empaphon drupes, kinds of olives, the essence of which forms a perfume sought for by the natives, spinning of the cotton, the fibres of which are twisted by means of a spindle 1.5 feet long, to which the spinners impart a rapid rotation, the fabrication of bark stuffs with the mallet, the extraction from the tapioca roots, and the preparation of the earth for the different products of the country cassava, flour that they make from the manioc beans, of which the pods, 15 inches long, named mossitsanes, grow on trees 20 feet high, arachides intended to make oil perennial peas of a bright blue known under the name of teachilubes, the flowers of which relieve the slightly insipid taste of the milk of sorgo, native coffee, sugar canes, the juice of which is reduced to a syrup, onions, Indian pears, sesamum, cucumbers, the seeds of which are roasted like chestnuts, the preparation of fermented drinks, the malafori made with bananas, the pom and other liquors, the care of the domestic animals, of those cows that only allow themselves to be milked in the presence of their little one or of a stuffed calf, of those heifers of small race with short horns, some of which have a hump, of those goats which, in the country where their flesh serves for food, are an important object of exchange, one might say current money like the slave. Finally, the feeding of the birds, swine, sheep, oxen, and so forth, so the monotonous life of the prisoner during the first days after her arrival at the factory was continued. What passed in this enclosure reproduced very exactly the various acts of native existence outside. Alves lived like the other natives of Casound. The women of the establishment worked as they would have done in the town, for the greater comfort of their husbands or their masters. This long enumeration shows what rude labours fall on the feeble sex in those savage regions of the African continent. During this time the men smoke tobacco or hemp, chase the elephant or the buffalo, and hire themselves to the traders for the raids. The harvest of maize or of slaves is always a harvest that takes place in fixed seasons. Of those various occupations, Mrs. Weldon only saw in Alves's factory the part laid on the women. Sometimes she stopped, looking at them, while the slaves, it must be said, only replied to her by ugly grimaces. A race instinct led these unfortunates to hate a white woman, and they had no commiseration for her in their hearts. Halima alone was an exception, and Mrs. Weldon, having learned certain words of the native language, was soon able to exchange a few sentences with the young slave. Little Jack often accompanied his mother when she walked in the enclosure, but he wished very much to go outside. There was, however, in an enormous baobab, marabout nests formed of a few sticks, and suimangas nests, birds with scarlet breasts and throats which resemble those of the tisserms, then widows that strip the thatch for the benefit of their family. Calaos, whose song was agreeable, bright grey parrots with red tails, which in the Maniama are called rouse, and give their name to the chiefs of the tribes, insectivorous draugos, similar to grey linnets with large red beaks. Here and there also fluttered hundreds of butterflies of different species, especially in the neighbourhood of the brooks that crossed the factory. But that was rather Cousin Benedict's affair than little Jack's, and the latter regretted greatly not being taller, so as to look over the walls. Alas, where was his poor friend Dick Sand, he who had brought him so high up in the Pilgrim's masts? How he would have followed him on the branches of those trees, whose tops rose to more than 100 feet. What good times they would have had together. Cousin Benedict always found himself very well where he was, provided insects were not lacking. Happily, he had discovered in the factory, and he studied as much as he could without magnifying glass or spectacles, a small bee which forms its cells among the wormholes of the wood, and a sphex that lays its eggs in cells that are not its own, as the cuckoo in the nests of other birds. Mosquitoes were not lacking either on the banks of the rivulets, and they tattooed him with bites to the extent of making him unrecognizable. And when Mrs. Weldon reproached him with letting himself be thus devoured by those venomous insects, "It is their instinct, Cousin Weldon," he replied to her, scratching himself till the blood came. "It is their instinct, and we must not have a grudge against them." At last, one day, it was the 17th of June, Cousin Benedict was on the point of being the happiest of entomologists. But this adventure, which had unexpected consequences, needs to be related with some minuteness. It was about 11 o'clock in the morning. An overpowering heat had obliged the inhabitants of the factory to keep in their huts, and one would not even meet a single native in the streets of Casound. Mrs. Weldon was dozing near little Jack, who was sleeping soundly. Cousin Benedict himself, suffering from the influence of this tropical temperature, had given up his favourite hunts, which was a great sacrifice for him, for in those rays of the midday sun he heard the rustle of a whole world of insects. He was sheltered then at the end of his hut, and there sleep began to take possession of him in this involuntary siesta. Suddenly, as his eyes half closed, he heard a humming. This is one of those insupportable buzzings of insects, some of which can give 15 or 16,000 beats of their wings in a second. "A hexapode!" exclaimed Cousin Benedict, awakened at once, and passing from the horizontal to the vertical position. There was no doubt that it was a hexapode that was buzzing in his hut. But if Cousin Benedict was very near-sighted, he had at least very acute hearing, so acute even that he could recognize one insect from another by the intensity of its buzz, and it seemed to him that this one was unknown, though it could only be produced by a giant of the species. What is this hexapode? Cousin Benedict asked himself. Behold him seeking to perceive the insect, which was very difficult to his eyes without glasses, but trying above all to recognize it by the buzzing of its wings. His instinct as an entomologist warned him that he had something to accomplish, and that the insect so providentially entered into his hut ought not to be the first comer. Cousin Benedict no longer moved. He listened. A few rays of light reached him. His eyes then discovered a large black point that flew about, but did not pass near enough for him to recognize it. He held his breath, and if he felt himself stung in some part of the face or hands, he was determined not to make a single movement that might put his hexapode to flight. At last the buzzing insect, after turning around him for a long time, came to rest on his head. Cousin Benedict's mouth widened for an instant, as if to give a smile, and what a smile! He felt the light animal running on his hair. An irresistible desire to put his hand there seized him for a moment, but he resisted it and did well. No, no, thought he, I would miss it, or what would be worse, I would injure it. Let it come more within my reach. See it walking, it descends. I feel its dear little feet running on my skull. This must be a hexapode of great height. My God, only grant that it may descend on the end of my nose, and there by squinting a little I might perhaps see it, and determine to what order, genus, species, or variety it belongs. So thought Cousin Benedict, but it was a long distance from his skull, which was rather pointed, to the end of his nose, which was very long. How many other roads the capricious insect might take beside his ears, beside his forehead, roads that would take it to a distance from the savant's eyes, without counting that at any moment it might retake its flight, leave the hut, and lose itself in those solar rays where, doubtless, its life was past, and in the midst of the buzzing of its congeners that would attract it outside. Cousin Benedict said all that to himself. Never in all his life as an entomologist had he passed more touching minutes. An African hexapode of a new species, or at least of a new variety, or even of a new subvariety, was there on his head, and he could not recognize it except it deigned to walk at least an inch from his eyes. However, Cousin Benedict's prayer must be heard. The insect, after having travelled over the half-bald head as on the summit of some wild bush, began to descend Cousin Benedict's forehead, and the latter might at last conceive the hope that it would venture to the top of his nose. Once arrived at that top, why would it not descend to the base? In its place I would descend, thought the worthy savant. What is truer than that in Cousin Benedict's place? Any other would have struck his forehead violently, so as to crush the enticing insect, or at least to put it to flight. To feel 6 feet moving on his skin, without speaking of the fear of being bitten, and not make a gesture, one will agree that it was the height of heroism, the Spartan allowing his breast to be devoured by a fox, the Roman holding burning coals between his fingers, were not more masters of themselves than Cousin Benedict, who was undoubtedly descended from those two heroes. After 20 little circuits, the insect arrived at the top of the nose. Then there was a moment's hesitation that made all Cousin Benedict's blood rush to his heart. Would the hexapode ascend again beyond the line of the eyes, or would it descend below? It descended. Cousin Benedict felt its caterpillar feet coming toward the base of his nose. The insect turned neither to the right nor to the left. It rested between its two buzzing wings on the slightly hooked edge of that learned nose, so well formed to carry spectacles. It cleared the little furrow produced by the incessant use of that optical instrument, so much missed by the poor cousin, and it stopped just at the extremity of his nasal appendage. It was the best place this hexapode could choose. At that distance, Cousin Benedict's two eyes, by making their visual rays converge, could, like two lenses, dart their double look on the insect. "Almighty God!" exclaimed Cousin Benedict, who could not repress a cry. "The tuberculous manticore!" Now he must not cry it out, he must only think it. But was it not too much to ask from the most enthusiastic of entomologists? To have on the end of his nose a tuberculous manticore with large elytrums, an insect of the Cicindelites tribe, a very rare specimen in collections, one that seems peculiar to those southern parts of Africa, and yet not utter a cry of admiration, that is beyond human strength. Unfortunately, the manticore heard this cry, which was almost immediately followed by a sneeze that shook the appendage on which it rested. Cousin Benedict wished to take possession of it, extended his hand, shut it violently, and only succeeded in seizing the end of his own nose. "Malediction!" exclaimed he, but then he showed a remarkable coolness. He knew that the tuberculous manticore only flutters about, so to say, that it walks rather than flies. He then knelt and succeeded in perceiving at less than 10 inches from his eyes the black point that was gliding rapidly in a ray of light. Evidently it was better to study it in this independent attitude. Only he must not lose sight of it. To seize the manticore would be to risk crushing it. Cousin Benedict said to himself, "No, I shall follow it, I shall admire it, I have time enough to take it." Was Cousin Benedict wrong? However that may be, see him now on all fours, his nose to the ground like a dog that smells a scent, and following 7 or 8 inches behind the superb hexapode. One moment after he was outside his hut under the midday sun, and a few minutes later at the foot of the palisade that shut in Alves's establishment. At this place was the manticore going to clear the enclosure with a bound, and put a wall between its adorer and itself? No, that was not in its nature, and Cousin Benedict knew it well, so he was always there, crawling like a snake, too far off to recognize the insect entomologically. Besides, that was done, but near enough to perceive that large, moving point travelling over the ground. The manticore arrived near the palisade, had met the large entrance of a molehill that opened at the foot of the enclosure. There, without hesitating, it entered this subterranean gallery, for it is in the habit of seeking those obscure passages. Cousin Benedict believed that he was going to lose sight of it, but to his great surprise, the passage was at least 2 feet high, and the molehill formed a gallery where his long, thin body could enter. Besides, he put the ardour of a ferret into his pursuit, and did not even perceive that in earthing himself thus he was passing outside the palisade. In fact, the molehill established a natural communication between the inside and the outside. In half a minute Cousin Benedict was outside of the factory. That did not trouble him. He was absorbed in admiration of the elegant insect that was leading him on. But the latter, doubtless, had enough of this long walk. its elytrums turned aside, its wings spread out. Cousin Benedict felt the danger, and with his curved hand he was going to make a provisional prison for the manticore when, frrrr, it flew away. What despair! But the manticore could not go far. Cousin Benedict rose, he looked, he darted forward, his two hands stretched out and open. The insect flew above his head, and he only perceived a large black point without appreciable form to him. Would the manticore come to the ground again to rest, after having traced a few capricious circles around Cousin Benedict's bald head? All the probabilities were in favour of its doing so. Unfortunately for the unhappy savant, this part of Alves's establishment, which was situated at the northern extremity of the town, bordered on a vast forest, which covered the territory of Casound for a space of several square miles. If the manticore gained the cover of the trees, and if there it should flutter from branch to branch, he must renounce all hope of making it figure in that famous tin box, in which it would be the most precious jewel. Alas, that was what happened. The manticore had rested again on the ground. Cousin Benedict, having the unexpected hope of seeing it again, threw himself on the ground at once. But the manticore no longer walked, it proceeded by little jumps. Cousin Benedict, exhausted, his knees and hands bleeding, jumped also. His two arms, his hands open, were extended to the right, to the left, according as the black point bounded here or there. It might be said that he was drawing his body over that burning soil, as a swimmer does on the surface of the water. Useless trouble. His two hands always closed on nothing. The insect escaped him while playing with him, and soon arrived under the fresh branches. It arose after throwing into Cousin Benedict's ear, which it touched lightly, the most intense but also the most ironical buzzing of its colopter wings. "Malediction!" exclaimed Cousin Benedict a second time. "It escapes me, ungrateful hexapode, thou to whom I reserved a place of honour in my collection. Well, no, I shall not give thee up, I shall follow thee till I reach thee." He forgot, this discomfited cousin, that his near-sighted eyes would not enable him to perceive the manticore among the foliage. But he was no longer master of himself. Vexation, anger, made him a fool. It was himself, and only himself, that he must blame for his loss. If he had taken possession of the insect at first, instead of following it in its independent ways, nothing of all that would have happened, and he would possess that admirable specimen of African manticores, the name of which is that of a fabulous animal, having a man's head and a lion's body. Cousin Benedict had lost his head. He little thought that the most unforeseen of circumstances had just restored him to liberty. He did not dream that the ant-hill into which he had just entered had opened to him an escape, and that he had just left Alves's establishment. The forest was there, and under the trees was his manticore flying away. At any price he wanted to see it again, see him then running across the thick forest, no longer conscious even of what he was doing, always imagining he saw the precious insect, beating the air with his long arms like a gigantic field spider. Where he was going, how he would return, and if he should return, he did not even ask himself, and for a good mile he made his way thus, at the risk of being met by some native or attacked by some beast. Suddenly, as he passed near a thicket, a gigantic being sprang out and threw himself on him. Then, as Cousin Benedict would have done with the manticore, that being seized him with one hand by the nape of the neck, with the other by the lower part of the back, and before he had time to know what was happening, he was carried across the forest. Truly, Cousin Benedict had that day lost a fine occasion of being able to proclaim himself the happiest entomologist of the 5 parts of the world. *******. Chapter 34. When Mrs. Weldon on the 17th of the month did not see cousin Benedict reappear at the accustomed hour, she was seized with the greatest uneasiness. She could not imagine what had become of her big baby. That he had succeeded in escaping from the factory, the enclosure of which was absolutely impassable, was not admissible. Besides, Mrs. Weldon knew her cousin. Had one proposed to this original to flee, abandoning his tin box and his collection of African insects, he would have refused without the shadow of hesitation. Now the box was there in the hut, intact, containing all that the savant had been able to collect since his arrival on the continent. To suppose that he was voluntarily separated from his entomological treasures was inadmissible. Nevertheless, cousin Benedict was no longer in José Antonio Alves's establishment. During all that day Mrs. Weldon looked for him persistently. Little Jack and the slave Halima joined her. It was useless. Mrs. Weldon was then forced to adopt this sad hypothesis. The prisoner had been carried away by the trader's orders, for motives that she could not fathom. But then, what had Alves done with him? Had he incarcerated him in one of the barracks of the large square? Why this carrying away, coming after the agreement made between Mrs. Weldon and Negoro, an agreement which included cousin Benedict in the number of the prisoners whom the trader would conduct to Mossaimes, to be placed in James W. Weldon's hands for a ransom? If Mrs. Weldon had been a witness of Alves's anger, when the latter learned of the prisoner's disappearance, she would have understood that this disappearance was indeed made against his will. But then, if cousin Benedict had escaped voluntarily, why had he not let her into the secret of his escape? However, the search of Alves and his servants, which was made with the greatest care, led to the discovery of that molehill, which put the factory in direct communication with the neighbouring forest. The trader no longer doubted that the fly hunter had fled by that narrow opening. One may then judge of his fury when he said to himself that this flight would doubtless be put to account and would diminish the prize that the affair would bring him. That imbecile is not worth much, thought he, nevertheless I shall be compelled to pay dear for him. Ah, if I take him again! But notwithstanding the searchings that were made inside, and though the woods were beaten over a large radius, it was impossible to find any trace of the fugitive. Mrs. Weldon must resign herself to the loss of her cousin, and Alves mourn over his prisoner, as it could not be admitted that the latter had established communications with the outside. It appeared evident that chance alone had made him discover the existence of the molehill, and that he had taken flight without thinking any more of those he left behind than if they had never existed. Mrs. Weldon was forced to allow that it must be so, but she did not dream of blaming the poor man, so perfectly unconscious of his actions. The unfortunate, what will become of him, she asked herself. It is needless to say that the molehill had been closed up the same day, and with the greatest care, and that the watch was doubled inside as well as outside the factory. The monotonous life of the prisoners then continued for Mrs. Weldon and her child. Meanwhile, a climatic fact very rare at that period of the year was produced in the province. Persistent rains began about the 19th of June, though the massacre period that finishes in April was past. In fact, the sky was covered, and continual showers inundated the territory of Casound. What was only a vexation for Mrs. Weldon, because she must renounce her walks inside the factory, became a public misfortune for the natives. The low lands, covered with harvests already ripe, were entirely submerged. The inhabitants of the province to whom the crop suddenly failed soon found themselves in distress. All the labours of the season were compromised, and Queen Moini, any more than her ministers, did not know how to face the catastrophe. They then had recourse to the magicians, but not to those whose profession is to heal the sick by their incantations and sorceries, or who predict success to the natives. There was a public misfortune on hand, and the best mgangas, who have the privilege of provoking or stopping the rains, were prayed to conjure away the peril. Their labour was in vain. It was in vain that they intoned their monotonous chant, rang their little bells and handbells, employed their most precious amulets, and more particularly a horn full of mud and bark, the point of which was terminated by 3 little horns. The spirits were exorcised by throwing little balls of dung, or in spitting in the faces of the most august personages of the court, but they did not succeed in chasing away the bad spirits that presided over the formation of the clouds. Now things were going from bad to worse, when Queen Moini thought of inviting a celebrated magician, then in the north of Angola. He was a magician of the first order, whose power was the more marvellous because they had never tested it in this country where he had never come, but there was no question of its success among the massacres. It was on the 25th of June in the morning that the new magician suddenly announced his arrival at Kasound with great ringing of bells. This sorcerer came straight to the teacher Toka, and immediately the crowd of natives rushed toward him. The sky was a little less rainy, the wind indicated a tendency to change, and those signs of calm, coinciding with the arrival of the magician, predisposed the minds of the natives in his favour. Besides, he was a superb man, a black of the finest water. He was at least 6 feet high and must be extraordinarily strong. This prestige already influenced the crowd. Generally, the sorcerers were in bands of 3, 4, or 5 when they went through the villages, and a certain number of acolytes or companions made their cortege. This magician was alone. His whole breast was zebraed with white marks done with pipe clay. The lower part of his body disappeared under an ample skirt of grass stuff, the train of which would not have disgraced a modern elegant. A collar of birds' skulls was round his neck. On his head was a sort of leathern helmet, with plumes ornamented with pearls. Around his loins a copper belt, to which hung several hundred bells, noisier than the sonorous harness of a Spanish mule. Thus this magnificent specimen of the corporation of native wizards was dressed. All the material of his art was comprised in a kind of basket, of which a calabash formed the bottom, and which was filled with shells, amulets, little wooden idols, and other fetiches, plus a notable quantity of dung balls, important accessories to the incantations and divinatory practices of the centre of Africa. One peculiarity was soon discovered by the crowd. This magician was dumb, but this infirmity could only increase the consideration with which they were disposed to surround him. He only made a guttural sound, low and languid, which had no signification, the more reason for being well skilled in the mysteries of witchcraft. The magician first made the tour of the great place, executing a kind of dance which put in motion all his chime of bells. The crowd followed, imitating his movements, it might be said, as a troop of monkeys following a gigantic, 4-handed animal. Then suddenly the sorcerer, treading the principal street of Kasound, went toward the royal residence. As soon as Queen Moini had been informed of the arrival of the new wizard, she appeared followed by her courtiers. The magician bowed to the ground and lifted up his head again, showing his superb height. His arms were then extended toward the sky, which was rapidly furrowed by masses of clouds. The sorcerer pointed to those clouds with his hand. He imitated their movements in an animated pantomime. He showed them fleeing to the west, but returning to the east by a rotary movement that no power could stop. Then, suddenly, to the great surprise of the town and the court, this sorcerer took the redoubtable sovereign of Khazound by the hand. A few courtiers wished to oppose this act, which was contrary to all etiquette, but the strong magician, seizing the nearest by the nape of the neck, sent him staggering 15 paces off. The queen did not appear to disapprove of this proud manner of acting. A sort of grimace, which ought to be a smile, was addressed to the wizard, who drew the queen on with rapid steps, while the crowd rushed after him. This time it was toward Alves's establishment that the sorcerer directed his steps. He soon reached the door, which was shut. A simple blow from his shoulder threw it to the ground, and he led the conquered queen into the interior of the factory. The trader, his soldiers and his slaves, ran to punish the daring being who took it upon himself to throw down doors without waiting for them to be opened to him. Suddenly, seeing that their sovereign did not protest, they stood still in a respectful attitude. No doubt Alves was about to ask the queen why he was honoured by her visit, but the magician did not give him time. Making the crowd recede so as to leave a large space free around him, he recommenced his pantomime with still greater animation. He pointed to the clouds, he threatened them, he exorcised them. He made a sign as if he could first stop them and then scatter them. His enormous cheeks were puffed out, and he blew on this mass of heavy vapours as if he had the strength to disperse them. Then, standing upright, he seemed to intend stopping them in their course, and one would have said that, owing to his gigantic height, he could have seized them. The superstitious Moyni, overcome by the acting of this tall comedian, could no longer control herself. Cries escaped her. She raved in her turn and instinctively repeated the magician's gestures. The courtiers and the crowd followed her example, and the mute's guttural sounds were lost amid those songs, cries and yells which the native language furnishes with so much prodigality. Did the clouds cease to rise on the eastern horizon and veil the tropical sun? Did they vanish before the exorcisms of this new wizard? No. And just at this moment, when the queen and her people imagined that they had appeased the evil spirits that had watered them with so many showers, the sky, somewhat clear since daybreak, became darker than ever. Large drops of rain fell pattering on the ground. Then a sudden change took place in the crowd. They then saw that this sorcerer was worth no more than the others. The queen's brows were frowning. They understood that he at least was in danger of losing his ears. The natives had contracted the circle around him. Fists threatened him, and they were about to punish him, when an unforeseen incident changed the object of their evil intentions. The magician, who overlooked the whole yelling crowd, stretched his arms toward one spot in the enclosure. The gesture was so imperious that all turned to look at it. Mrs. Weldon and little Jack, attracted by the noise and the clamour, had just left their hut. The magician, with an angry gesture, had pointed to them with his left hand, while his right was raised toward the sky. It was this white woman, it was her child, they were causing all this evil. They had brought these clouds from their rainy country to inundate the territories of Khazound. It was at once understood. Queen Moyni, pointing to Mrs. Weldon, made a threatening gesture. The natives, uttering still more terrible cries, rushed toward her. Mrs. Weldon thought herself lost, and clasping her son in her arms, she stood motionless as a statue before this overexcited crowd. The magician went toward her. The natives stood aside in the presence of this wizard, who, with the cause of the evil, seemed to have found the remedy. The trader Alves, knowing that the life of the prisoner was precious, now approached, not being sure of what he ought to do. The magician had seized little Jack, and snatching him from his mother's arms, he held him toward the sky. It seemed as if he were about to dash the child to the earth so as to appease the gods. With a terrible cry, Mrs. Weldon fell to the ground insensible. But the magician, after having made a sign to the Queen, which no doubt reassured her as to his intentions, raised the unhappy mother, and while the crowd, completely subdued, parted to give him space, he carried her away with her child. Alves was furious, not expecting this result, after having lost one of the 3 prisoners, to see the prize confided to his care thus escape, and with the prize the large bribe promised him by Negoro. Never, not if the whole territory of Kasound was submerged by a new deluge. He tried to oppose this abduction. The natives now began to mutter against him. The Queen had him seized by her guards, and knowing what it might cost him, the trader was forced to keep quiet, while cursing the stupid credulity of Queen Moini's subjects. The savages, in fact, expected to see the clouds disappear with those who had brought them, and they did not doubt that the magician would destroy the scourge, from which they suffered so much, in the blood of the strangers. Meanwhile, the magician carried off his victims as a lion would a couple of kids which did not satisfy his powerful appetite. Little Jack was terrified, his mother was unconscious. The crowd, roused to the highest degree of fury, escorted the magician with yells, but he left the enclosure, crossed Kasound and re-entered the forest, walking nearly 3 miles without resting for a moment. Finally he was alone, the natives having understood that he did not wish to be followed. He arrived at the bank of a river whose rapid current flowed toward the north. There, at the end of a large opening, behind the long, drooping branches of a thicket which hid the steep bank, was moored a canoe, covered by a sort of thatch. The magician lowered his double burden into the boat, and following himself, shoved out from the bank, and the current rapidly carried them down the stream. The next minute he said in a very distinct voice, "Captain, here are Mrs. Weldon and little Jack. I present them to you. Forward, and may all the clouds in heaven fall on those idiots of Kasound." Chapter 35. It was Hercules, not easily recognized in his magician's attire, who was speaking thus, and it was Dick Sand whom he was addressing, Dick Sand, still feeble enough to lean on Cousin Benedict, near whom Dingo was lying. Mrs. Weldon, who had regained consciousness, could only pronounce these words. "You, Dick, you." The young novice rose, but already Mrs. Weldon was pressing him in her arms, and Jack was lavishing caresses on him. My friend Dick," repeated the little boy. Then turning to Hercules, "And I," he added, "I did not know you." "Hey, what a disguise," replied Hercules, rubbing his breast to efface the variety of colours that striped it. "You were too ugly," said little Jack. "Bless me, I was the devil, and the devil is not handsome." "Hercules," said Mrs. Weldon, holding out her hand to the brave black. "He has delivered you," added Dick Sand, "as he has saved me, though he will not allow it." Saved, we are not saved yet," replied Hercules. "And besides, without Mr. Benedict, who came to tell us where you were, Mrs. Weldon, we could not have done anything." In fact, it was Hercules who, 5 days before, had jumped upon the savant at the moment when, having been led 2 miles from the factory, the latter was running in pursuit of his precious manticore. Without this incident, neither Dick Sand nor the black would have known Mrs. Weldon's retreat, and Hercules would not have ventured to Kasound in a magician's dress. While the boat drifted with rapidity in this narrow part of the river, Hercules related what had passed since his flight from the camp on the Conza. How, without being seen, he had followed the kitanda in which Mrs. Weldon and her son were, how he had found Dingo wounded, how the two had arrived in the neighbourhood of Kasound, how a note from Hercules, carried by the dog, told Dick Sand what had become of Mrs. Weldon, how, after the unexpected arrival of Cousin Benedict, he had vainly tried to make his way into the factory, more carefully guarded than ever, how, at last, he had found this opportunity of snatching the prisoner from that horrible José Antonio Alves. Now this opportunity had offered itself that same day. A mganga, or magician, on his witchcraft circuit, that celebrated magicians so impatiently expected, was passing through the forest in which Hercules roamed every night, watching, waiting, ready for anything. To spring upon the magician, despoil him of his baggage and of his magician's vestments, to fasten him to the foot of a tree with lion knots that the Davenports themselves could not have untied, to paint his body, taking the sorcerers for a model, and to act out his character in charming and controlling the reins, had been the work of several hours. Still, the incredible credulity of the natives was necessary for his success. During this recital given rapidly by Hercules, nothing concerning Dick Sand had been mentioned. "And you, Dick?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "I, Mrs. Weldon," replied the young man. "I can tell you nothing. My last thought was for you, for Jack. I tried in vain to break the cords that fastened me to the stake. The water rose over my head. I lost consciousness. When I came to myself, I was sheltered in a hole, concealed by the papyrus of this bank, and Hercules was on his knees beside me, lavishing his care upon me. "Well, that is because I am a physician," replied Hercules, "a diviner, a sorcerer, a magician, a fortune-teller." "Hercules," said Mrs. Weldon, "tell me, how did you save Dick Sand?" "Did I do it, Mrs. Weldon?" replied Hercules. "Might not the current have broken the stake to which our captain was tied, and in the middle of the night carried him half dead on this beam to the place where I received him? Besides, in the darkness, there was no difficulty in gliding among the victims that carpeted the ditch, waiting for the bursting of the dam, diving under water, and with a little strength pulling up our captain and the stake to which these scoundrels had bound him. There was nothing very extraordinary in all that. The first comer could have done as much. Mr. Benedict himself, or even Dingo, in fact, might it not have been Dingo? A yelping was heard, and Jack, taking hold of the dog's large head, gave him several little friendly taps. "Dingo," he asked, "did you save our friend Dick?" At the same time he turned the dog's head from right to left. "He says no, Hercules," said Jack. "You see that it was not he. Dingo, did Hercules save our captain?" The little boy forced Dingo's good head to move up and down 5 or 6 times. "He says yes, Hercules. He says yes," cried little Jack. "You see then that it was you." "Friend Dingo," replied Hercules, caressing the dog, "that is wrong. You promised me not to betray me." Yes, it was indeed Hercules who had risked his life to save Dick Sand, but he had done it, and his modesty would not allow him to agree to the fact. Besides, he thought it a very simple thing, and he repeated that any one of his companions would have done the same under the circumstances. This led Mrs. Weldon to speak of old Tom, of his son, of Actaeon and Bat, his unfortunate companions. They had started for the lake region. Hercules had seen them pass with the caravan of slaves. He had followed them, but no opportunity to communicate with them had presented itself. They were gone, they were lost. Hercules had been laughing heartily, but now he shed tears which he did not try to restrain. "Do not cry, my friend," Mrs. Weldon said to him. "God may be merciful and allow us to meet them again." In a few words she informed Dick Sand of all that had happened during her stay in Alves's factory. "Perhaps," she added, "it would have been better to have remained at Casound." "What a fool I was!" cried Hercules. "No, Hercules, no," said Dick Sand. These wretches would have found means to draw Mr. Weldon into some new trap. Let us flee together, and without delay. We shall reach the coast before Negoro can return to Mosaeimnes. There the Portuguese authorities will give us aid and protection, and when Alves comes to take his $100,000, 100,000 blows on the old scoundrel's skull, cried Hercules, and I will undertake to keep the count. However, here was a new complication. Although it was very evident that Mrs. Weldon would not dream of returning to Casound, the point now was to anticipate Negoro. All Dick Sand's projects must tend toward that end. Dick Sand was now putting in practice the plan which he had long contemplated, of gaining the coast by utilizing the current of a river or a stream. Now the watercourse was there, its direction was northward, and it was possible that it emptied into the Zaire. In that case, instead of reaching St. Paul de Londe, it would be at the mouth of the great river that Mrs. Weldon and her companions would arrive. This was not important, because help would not fail them in the colonies of Lower Guinea. Having decided to descend the current of this river, Dick Sand's first idea was to embark on one of the herbaceous rafts, a kind of floating isle of which Cameron has often spoken, which drifts in large numbers on the surface of African rivers. But Hercules, while roaming at night on the bank, had been fortunate enough to find a drifting boat. Dick Sand could not hope for anything better, and chance had served him kindly. In fact, it was not one of those narrow boats which the natives generally use. The pirogue found by Hercules was one of those whose length exceeds 30 feet, and the width 4, and they are carried rapidly on the waters of the Great Lakes by the aid of numerous paddles. Mrs. Weldon and her companions could install themselves comfortably in it, and it was sufficient to keep it in the stream by means of an oar to descend the current of the river. At first, Dick Sand, wishing to pass unseen, had formed a project to travel only at night, but to drift 12 hours out of the 24 was to double the length of a journey which might be quite long. Happily, Dick Sand had taken a fancy to cover the pirogue with a roof of long grasses, sustained on a rod which projected fore and aft. This, when on the water, concealed even the long oar. One would have said that it was a pile of herbs which drifted downstream, in the midst of floating islets. Such was the ingenious arrangement of the thatch that the birds were deceived, and seeing there some grains to pilfer red-beaked gulls, orhiniscas of black plumage and grey and white halcyons frequently came to rest upon it. Besides, this green roof formed a shelter from the heat of the sun. A voyage made under these conditions might then be accomplished almost without fatigue, but not without danger. In fact, the journey would be a long one, and it would be necessary to procure food each day. Hence the risk of hunting on the banks if fishing would not suffice, and Dick Sand had no firearms but the gun carried off by Hercules after the attack on the ant hill. But he counted on every shot. Perhaps even by passing his gun through the thatch of the boat he might fire with surety, like a butter through the holes in his hut. Meanwhile, the pirogue drifted with the force of the current a distance not less than 2 miles an hour. As near as Dick Sand could estimate it, he hoped to make thus 50 miles a day. But on account of this very rapidity of the current, continual care was necessary to avoid obstacles, rocks, trunks of trees, and the high bottoms of the river. Besides, it was to be feared that this current would change to rapids or to cataracts, a frequent occurrence on the rivers of Africa. The joy of seeing Mrs. Weldon and her child had restored all Dick Sand's strength, and he had posted himself in the forepart of the boat. Across the long grasses his glance observed the downward course, and either by voice or gesture He indicated to Hercules, whose vigorous hands held the oar, what was necessary so as to keep in the right direction. Mrs. Weldon reclined on a bed of dry leaves in the centre of the boat and grew absorbed in her own thoughts. Cousin Benedict was taciturn, frowning at the sight of Hercules, whom he had not forgiven for his intervention in the affair of the Manticore. He dreamed of his lost collection, of his entomological notes, the value of which would not be appreciated by the natives of Casound. So he sat, his limbs stretched out and his arms crossed on his breast, and at times he instinctively made a gesture of raising to his forehead the glasses which his nose did not support. As for little Jack, he understood that he must not make a noise, but as motion was not forbidden, he imitated his friend Dingo, and ran on his hands and feet from one end of the boat to the other. During the first 2 days, Mrs. Weldon and her companions used the food that Hercules had been able to obtain before they started. Dick Sand only stopped for a few hours in the night so as to gain rest, but he did not leave the boat, not wishing to do it, except when obliged by the necessity of renewing their provisions. No incident marked the beginning of the voyage on this unknown river, which measured at least more than 150 feet in width. Several islets drifted on the surface and moved with the same rapidity as the boat, so there was no danger of running upon them unless some obstacle stopped them. The banks, besides, seemed to be deserted. Evidently, these portions of the territory of Casound were little frequented by the natives. Numerous wild plants covered the banks and relieved them with a profusion of the most brilliant colours. Swallowwort, iris, lilies, clematis, balsams, umbrella-shaped flowers, aloes, tree ferns and spicy shrubs formed a border of incomparable brilliancy. Several forests came to bathe their borders in these rapid waters. Copal trees, acacias, borhinias of iron wood, the trunks covered with a dross of lichens on the side exposed to the coldest winds, fig trees which rose above roots arranged in rows like mangroves, and other trees of magnificent growth overhung the river. Their high tops, joining 100 feet above, formed a bower which the solar rays could not penetrate. Often also a bridge of lions was thrown from one bank to the other, and during the 27th little Jack, to his intense admiration, saw a band of monkeys cross one of these vegetable passes, holding each other's tail, lest the bridge should break under their weight. These monkeys are a kind of small chimpanzee, which in Central Africa has received the name of sokos. They have low foreheads, clear yellow faces and high-set ears, and are very ugly examples of the simisk race. They live in bands of 12 bark like dogs and are feared by the natives, whose children they often carry off to scratch or bite. In passing the Lion Bridge they never suspected that, beneath that mass of herbs which the current bore onward, there was a little boy who would have exactly served to amuse them. The preparations, designed by Dick Sand, were very well conceived because these clear-sighted beasts were deceived by them. 20 miles farther on that same day the boat was suddenly stopped in its progress. "What is the matter?" asked Hercules, always posted at his oar. "A barrier," replied Dick Sand, "but a natural barrier. It must be broken, Mr. Dick." "Yes, Hercules, and with a hatchet. Several islets have drifted upon it, and it is quite strong." "To work, Captain, to work," replied Hercules, who came and stood in the forepart of the pirogue. This barricade was formed by the interlacing of a sticky plant with glossy leaves, which twists as it is pressed together and becomes very resisting. They call it ticka-ticka, and it will allow people to cross watercourses dry-shod, if they are not afraid to plunge 12 inches into its green apron. Magnificent ramifications of the lotus covered the surface of this barrier. It was already dark. Hercules could, without imprudence, quit the boat, and he managed his hatchet so skillfully that 2 hours afterward the barrier had given way. The current turned up the broken pieces on the banks, and the boat again took the channel. Must it be confessed, that great child of a cousin Benedict had hoped for a moment that they would not be able to pass. Such a voyage seemed to him unnecessary. He regretted Alves's factory and the hut that contained his precious entomologist's box. His chagrin was real, and indeed it was pitiful to see the poor man. Not an insect, no, not one to preserve. What then was his joy when Hercules, his pupil after all, brought him a horrible little beast, which he had found on a sprig of the ticka-ticka. Singularly enough, the brave black seemed a little confused in presenting it to him. But what exclamations cousin Benedict uttered when he had brought this insect, which he held between his index finger and his thumb, as near as possible to his short-sighted eyes, which neither glasses nor microscope could now assist. "Hercules!" he cried, "Hercules! Ah, see what will gain your pardon. Cousin Weldon, Dick, a hexapode unique in its species and of African origin. This, at least, they will not dispute with me, and it shall quit me only with my life." "It is, then, very precious?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "Precious," cried cousin Benedict. "An insect which is neither a coleopter nor a neuropteran nor a hymenopter, which does not belong to any of the 10 orders recognized by savants, and which they will be rather tempted to rank in the second section of the arachnids. A sort of spider, which would be a spider if it had 8 legs, and is, however, a hexapode because it has but 6. Ah, my friends, heaven owed me this joy, and at length I shall give my name to a scientific discovery. That insect shall be the hexapodes benedictus." The enthusiastic savant was so happy, he forgot so many miseries past and to come in riding his favourite hobby, that neither Mrs. Weldon nor Dick Sand grudged him his felicitations. All this time the pirogue moved on the dark waters of the river. The silence of night was only disturbed by the clattering scales of the crocodiles, or the snorting of the hippopotami that sported on the banks. Then, through the sprigs of the thatch, the moon appeared behind the tops of the trees, throwing its soft light to the interior of the boat. Suddenly, on the right bank, was heard a distant hubbub, then a dull noise as if giant pumps were working in the dark. It was several hundred elephants that, satiated by the woody roots which they had devoured during the day, came to quench their thirst before the hour of repose. One would really have supposed that all these trunks, lowered and raised by the same automatic movement, would have drained the river dry. Chapter 36. For 8 days the boat drifted, carried by the current under the conditions already described. No incident of any importance occurred. For a space of many miles the river bathed the borders of superb forests. Then the country, shorn of these fine trees, spread in jungles to the limits of the horizon. If there were no natives in this country, a fact which Dick Sand did not dream of regretting, the animals at least abounded there. Zebras sported on the banks, elks, and camas, a species of antelope which were extremely graceful, and they disappeared at night to give place to the leopards, whose growls could be heard, and even to the lions which bounded in the tall grasses. Thus far the fugitives had not suffered from these ferocious creatures, whether in the forests or in the river. Meanwhile, each day, generally in the afternoon, Dick Sand neared one bank or the other, moored the boat, disembarked, and explored the shore for a short distance. In fact, it was necessary to renew their daily food. Now, in this country, barren of all cultivation, they could not depend upon the tapioca, the sorgo, the maize, and the fruits, which formed the vegetable food of the native tribes. These plants only grew in a wild state and were not eatable. Dick Sand was thus forced to hunt, although the firing of his gun might bring about an unpleasant meeting. They made a fire by rubbing a little stick against a piece of the wild fig tree, native fashion or even Simisk style, for it is affirmed that certain of the guerrillas procure a fire by this means. Then for several days they cooked a little elk or antelope flesh. During the 4th of July, Dick Sand succeeded in killing with a single ball a poku, which gave them a good supply of venison. This animal was 5 feet long. It had long horns provided with rings, a yellowish-red skin, dotted with brilliant spots and white on the stomach, and the flesh was found to be excellent. It followed then, taking into account these almost daily landings and the hours of repose that were necessary at night, that the distance on the 8th of July could hot be estimated as more than 100 miles. This was considerable, however, and already Dick Sand asked himself where this interminable river ended. Its course absorbed some small tributaries and did not sensibly enlarge. As for the general direction, after having been north for a long time, it took a bend toward the northwest. However, this river furnished its share of food. Long lions armed with thorns which served as fishhooks caught several of those delicately flavoured sanjikas, which once smoked are easily carried in this region. Black usakas were also caught and some mormds with large heads, the gensiva of which have teeth like the hairs of a brush, and some little dagalas, the friends of running waters belonging to the kloop species and resembling the whitebait of the Thames. During the 9th of July, Dick Sand had to give proof of extreme coolness. He was alone on the shore carrying off a kama, the horns of which showed above the thicket. He had just shot it, and now there bounded 30 feet off a formidable hunter that no doubt came to claim its prey, and was not in a humour to give it up. It was a lion of great height, one of those which the natives call caramos, and not one of the kind without a mane named Lion of the Nyassi. This one measured 5 feet in height, a formidable beast. With one bound the lion had fallen on the kama, which Dick Sand's ball had just thrown to the ground, and still full of life it shook and cried under the paw of the powerful animal. Dick Sand was disarmed, not having had time to slide a second cartridge into his gun. Dick Sand in front, lowering his voice, gave directions to avoid striking against these rotten constructions. The night was clear. They saw well to direct the boat, but they could also be seen. Then came a terrible moment. 2 natives who talked in loud tones were squatting close to the water on the piles, between which the current carried the boat, and the direction could not be changed for a narrower pass. Now would they not see it, and at their cries might not the whole village be alarmed? A space of 100 feet at most remained to be passed, when Dick Sand heard the 2 natives call more quickly to each other. One showed the other the mass of drifting herbs, which threatened to break the long lion ropes which they were occupied in stretching at that moment. Rising hastily, they called out for help. 5 or 6 other blacks ran at once along the piles and posted themselves on the crossbeams which supported them, uttering loud exclamations which the listeners could not understand. In the boat, on the contrary, was absolute silence, except for the few orders given by Dick Sand in a low voice, and complete repose, except the movement of Hercules's right arm moving the oar. At times a low growl from Dingo, whose jaws Jack held together with his little hands. Outside, the murmur of the water which broke against the piles, then above, the cries of the ferocious cannibals. The natives, meanwhile, rapidly drew up their ropes. If they were raised in time the boat would pass, otherwise it would be caught, and all would be over with those who drifted in it. As for slackening or stopping its progress, Dick Sand could do neither, for the current, stronger under this narrow construction, carried it forward more rapidly. In half a minute the boat was caught between the piles. By an unheard-of piece of fortune, the last effort made by the natives had raised the ropes, but in passing, as Dick Sand had feared, the boat was deprived of a part of the grasses which now floated at its right. One of the natives uttered a cry. Had he had time to recognize what the roof covered, and was he going to alarm his comrades? It was more than probable. Dick Sand and his friends were already out of reach, and in a few moments, under the impetus of this current now changed into a kind of rapid, they had lost sight of the lacustrine village. To the left bank, Dick Sand ordered as being more prudent. The stream is again navigable. To the left bank, replied Hercules, giving the oar a vigorous stroke. Dick Sand stood beside him and looked at the surface of the water which the moon lit up. He saw nothing suspicious. Not a boat had started in pursuit. Perhaps these savages had none, and at daybreak not a native appeared either on the bank or on the water. After that, increasing their precautions, the boat kept close to the left bank. During the 4 following days, from the 11th to the 14th of July, Mrs. Weldon and her companions remarked that this portion of the territory had decidedly changed. It was no longer a deserted country. It was also a desert, and they might have compared it to that Kalahari explored by Livingstone on his first voyage. The arid soil recalled nothing of the fertile fields of the upper country, and always this interminable stream, to which might be given the name of river, as it seemed that it could only end at the Atlantic Ocean. The question of food in this desert country became a problem. Nothing remained of their former stock. Fishing gave little. Hunting was no longer of any use. Elks, antelopes, pocus, and other animals could find nothing to live on in this desert, and with them had also disappeared the carnivorous animals. The nights no longer echoed the accustomed roarings. Nothing broke the silence but the concert of frogs, which Cameron compares with the noise of calkers calking a ship, with riveters who rivet and the drillers who drill in a shipbuilder's yard. The country on the 2 banks was flat and destitute of trees as far as the most distant hills that bounded it on the east and west. The spurges grew alone and in profusion, not the euphospium which produces cassava or tapioca flour, but those from which they draw an oil which does not serve as food. Meantime it is necessary to provide some nourishment. Dick Sand knew not what to do, and Hercules reminded him that the natives often eat the young shoots of the ferns, and the pith which the papyrus leaf contains. He himself, while following the caravan of Ibn Elamis across the desert, had been more than once reduced to this expedient to satisfy his hunger. Happily, the ferns and the papyrus grew in profusion along the banks, and the marrow or pith, which has a sweet flavour, was appreciated by all, particularly by little Jack. This was not a very cheering prospect. The food was not strengthening, but the next day, thanks to Cousin Benedict, they were better served. Since the discovery of the Hexapodus benedictus, which was to immortalize his name, Cousin Benedict had recovered his usual manners. The insect was put in a safe place, that is to say, stuck in the crown of his hat, and the savant had recommenced his search whenever they were on shore. During that day, while hunting in the high grass, he started a bird whose warbling attracted him. Dick Sand was going to shoot it when Cousin Benedict cried out, "Don't fire, Dick, don't fire. The bird among 5 persons would not be enough. It will be enough for Jack," replied Dick Sand, taking aim at the bird, which was in no hurry to fly away. "No, no," said Cousin Benedict, "do not fire. It is an indicator, and it will bring us honey in abundance." Dick Sand lowered his gun, realizing that a few pounds of honey were worth more than one bird, and Cousin Benedict and he followed the bird, which rose and flew away, inviting them to go with it. They had not far to go, and a few minutes after, some old trunks hidden in between the spurges appeared in the midst of an intense buzzing of bees. Cousin Benedict would have preferred not to have robbed these industrious hymenopters of the fruit of their labours, as he expressed it, but Dick Sand did not understand it in that way. He smoked out the bees with some dry herbs and obtained a considerable quantity of honey. Then leaving to the indicator the cakes of wax, which made its share of the profit, Cousin Benedict and he returned to the boat. The honey was well received, but it was but little, and in fact all would have suffered cruelly from hunger if during the day of the 12th the boat had not stopped near a creek where some locusts swarmed. They covered the ground and the shrubs in myriads, 2 or 3 deep. Now, Cousin Benedict not failing to say that the natives frequently eat these orthopters, which was perfectly true, they took possession of this manor. There was enough to fill the boat 10 times, and broiled over a mild fire, these edible locusts would have seemed excellent even to less famished people. Cousin Benedict, for his part, eat a notable quantity of them, sighing, it is true, still he eat them. Nevertheless, it was time for this long series of moral and physical trials to come to an end. Although drifting on this rapid river was not so fatiguing as had been the walking through the first forests near the coast, still, the excessive heat of the day, the damp mists at night, and the incessant attacks of the mosquitoes made this descent of the watercourse very painful. It was time to arrive somewhere, and yet Dick Sand could see no limit to the journey. Would it last 8 days or a month? Nothing indicated an answer. Had the river flowed directly to the west, they would have already reached the northern coast of Angola, but the general direction had been rather to the north, and they could travel thus a long time before reaching the coast. Dick Sand was, therefore, extremely anxious when a sudden change of direction took place on the morning of the 14th of July. Little Jack was in the front of the boat, and he was gazing through the thatch, when a large expanse of water appeared on the horizon. "The sea," he shouted. At this word Dick Sand trembled and came close to little Jack. "The sea," he replied. "No, not yet, but at least a river which flows toward the west and of which this stream is only a tributary. Perhaps it is the Zaire itself." "May God grant that is," replied Mrs. Weldon. Yes, for if this were the Zaire or Congo which Stanley was to discover a few years later, they had only to descend its course so as to reach the Portuguese settlements at its mouth. Dick Sand hoped that it might be so, and he was inclined to believe it. During the 15th, 16th, 17th and 18th of July, in the midst of a more fertile country, the boat drifted on the silvery waters of the river. They still took the same precautions, and it was always a mass of herbs that the current seemed to carry on its surface. A few days more, and no doubt the survivors of the Pilgrim would see the termination of their miseries. Self-sacrifice had been shared in by all, and if the young novice would not claim the greater part of it, Mrs. Weldon would demand its recognition for him. But on the 18th of July, during the night, an incident took place which compromised the safety of the party. Toward 3 o'clock in the morning a distant noise, still very low, was heard in the west. Dick Sand, very anxious, wished to know what caused it. While Mrs. Weldon, Jack and Cousin Benedict slept in the bottom of the boat, he called Hercules to the front and told him to listen with the greatest attention. The night was calm. Not a breeze stirred the atmosphere. "It is the noise of the sea," said Hercules, whose eyes shone with joy. "No," replied Dick Sand, holding down his head. "What is it then?" asked Hercules. "Wait until day, but we must watch with the greatest care." At this answer, Hercules returned to his post. Dick Sand stood in front, listening all the time. The noise increased. It was soon like distant roaring. Day broke almost without dawn. About half a mile down the river, just above the water, a sort of cloud floated in the atmosphere, but it was not a mass of vapour, and this became only too evident when, under the first solar rays which broke in piercing it, a beautiful rainbow spread from one bank to the other. "To the shore!" cried Dick Sand, whose voice awoke Mrs. Weldon. "It is a cataract, those clouds are spray, to the shore, Hercules." Dick Sand was not mistaken. Before them the bed of the river broke in a descent of more than 100 feet, and the waters rushed down with superb but irresistible impetuosity. Another half-mile, and the boat would have been engulfed in the abyss. Chapter 37. With a vigorous plough of the oar, Hercules had pushed toward the left bank. Besides, the current was not more rapid in that place, and the bed of the river kept its normal declivity to the falls. As has been said, it was the sudden sinking of the ground, and the attraction was only felt 300 or 400 feet above the cataract. On the left bank were large and very thick trees. No light penetrated their impenetrable curtain. It was not without terror that Dick Sand looked at this territory, inhabited by the cannibals of the lower Congo, which he must now cross because the boat could no longer follow the stream. He could not dream of carrying it below the falls. It was a terrible blow for these poor people, on the eve perhaps of reaching the Portuguese villages at its mouth. They were well aided, however. Would not heaven come to their assistance? The boat soon reached the left bank of the river. As it drew near, Dingo gave strange marks of impatience and grief at the same time. Dick Sand, who was watching the animal, for all was danger, asked himself if some beast or some native was not concealed in the high papyrus of the bank, but he soon saw that the animal was not agitated by a sentiment of anger. "One would say that Dingo was crying," exclaimed little Jack, clasping Dingo in his 2 arms. Dingo escaped from him and, springing into the water when the boat was only 20 feet from the bank, reached the shore and disappeared among the bushes. Neither Mrs. Weldon, nor Dick Sand, nor Hercules knew what to think. They landed a few moments after in the middle of a foam green with hareweed and other aquatic plants. Some kingfishers, giving a sharp whistle, and some little herons, white as snow, immediately flew away. Hercules fastened the boat firmly to a mangrove stump, and all climbed up the steep bank overhung by large trees. There was no path in this forest. However, faint traces on the ground indicated that this place had been recently visited by natives or animals. Dick Sand, with loaded gun, and Hercules, with his hatchet in his hand, had not gone 10 steps before they found Dingo again. The dog, nose to the ground, was following a scent, barking all the time. A first inexplicable presentiment had drawn the animal to this part of the shore. A second led it into the depths of the wood. That was clearly visible to all. "Attention," said Dick Sand. "Mrs. Weldon, Mr. Benedict, Jack, do not leave us. Attention, Hercules." At this moment Dingo raised its head and by little bounds invited them to follow. A moment after Mrs. Weldon and her companions rejoined it at the foot of an old sycamore lost in the thickest part of the wood. There was a dilapidated hut with disjoined boards before which Dingo was barking lamentably. "Who can be there?" exclaimed Dick Sand. He entered the hut. Mrs. Weldon and the others followed him. The ground was scattered with bones, already bleached under the discolouring action of the atmosphere. "A man died in that hut," said Mrs. Weldon. "And Dingo knew that man," replied Dick Sand. It must have been his master. Ah, see, Dick Sand pointed to the naked trunk of the sycamore at the end of the hut, there appeared 2 large red letters already almost effaced, but which could be still distinguished. Dingo had rested its right paw on the tree, and it seemed to indicate them. "SV," exclaimed Dick Sand. Those letters which Dingo knew among all others, those initials that it carries on its collar. He did not finish, and stooping, he picked up a little copper box all oxidized which lay in a corner of the hut. That box was opened, and a morsel of paper fell from it, on which Dick Sand read these few words: "Assassinated, robbed by my guide Negoro, 3D December 1871, here 120 miles from the coast, Dingo, with me, S. Vernon." The note told everything. Samuel Vernon set out with his dog Dingo to explore the centre of Africa, guided by Negoro. The money which he carried had excited the wretch's cupidity, and he resolved to take possession of it. The French traveller, arrived at this point of the Congo's banks, had established his camp in this hut. There he was mortally wounded, robbed, abandoned. The murder accomplished, no doubt Negoro took to flight, and it was then that he fell into the hands of the Portuguese, recognized as one of the trader Alves's agents conducted to St. Paul de Londa. He was condemned to finish his days in one of the penitentiaries of the colony. We know that he succeeded in escaping, in reaching New Zealand, and how he embarked on the Pilgrim, to the misfortune of those who had taken passage on it. But what happened after the crime? Nothing but what was easy to understand. The unfortunate Vernon, before dying, had evidently had time to write the note which, with the date and the motive of the assassination, gave the name of the assassin. This note he had shut up in that box where, doubtless, the stolen money was, and in a last effort his bloody finger had traced like an epitaph the initials of his name. Before those 2 red letters Dingo must have remained for many days. He had learned to know them. He could no longer forget them. Then, returned to the coast, the dog had been picked up by the captain of the Waldeck, and finally on board the Pilgrim, found itself again with Negoro. During this time the bones of the traveller were whitening in the depths of this lost forest of Central Africa, and he no longer lived except in the remembrance of his dog. Yes, such must have been the way the events had happened. As Dick Sand and Hercules prepared to give a Christian burial to the remains of Samuel Yernon, Dingo, this time giving a howl of rage, dashed out of the hut. Almost at once horrible cries were heard at a short distance. Evidently a man was struggling with the powerful animal. Hercules did what Dingo had done. In his turn he sprang out of the hut, and Dick Sand, Mrs. Weldon, Jack Benedict, following his steps, saw him throw himself on a man who fell to the ground, held at the neck by the dog's formidable teeth. It was Negoro. In going to the mouth of the Zaire so as to embark for America, this rascal, leaving his escort behind, had come to the very place where he had assassinated the traveller who had trusted himself to him. But there was a reason for it, and all understood it when they perceived some handfuls of French gold which glittered in a recently dug hole at the foot of a tree. So it was evident that after the murder, and before falling into the hands of the Portuguese, Negoro had hidden the product of his crime, with the intention of returning some day to get it. He was going to take possession of this gold when Dingo scented him and sprang at his throat. The wretch, surprised, had drawn his cutlass and struck the dog at the moment when Hercules threw himself on him, crying, "Ah, villain, I am going to strangle you at last." There was nothing more to do. The Portuguese gave no sign of life, struck, it may be said, by divine justice, and on the very spot where the crime had been committed. But the faithful dog had received a mortal blow, and dragging itself to the hut, it came to die there, where Samuel Vernon had died. Hercules buried deep the traveller's remains, and Dingo, lamented by all, was put in the same grave as its master. Negoro was no more, but the natives who accompanied him from Kasound could not be far away. On not seeing him return, they would certainly seek him along the river. This was a very serious danger. Dick Sand and Mrs. Weldon took counsel as to what they should do, and do without losing an instant. One fact acquired was that this stream was the Congo, which the natives call Kwango or Ikautauya Congo, and which is the Zaire under one longitude, the Lualaba under another. It was indeed that great artery of Central Africa, to which the heroic Stanley has given the glorious name of Livingstone, but which the geographers should perhaps replace by his own. But if there was no longer any doubt that this was the Congo, the French traveller's note indicated that its mouth was still 120 miles from this point, and unfortunately at this place it was no longer navigable. High falls, very likely the falls of Entamo, forbid the descent of any boat. Thus it was necessary to follow one or the other bank, at least to a point below the cataracts, either 1 or 2 miles, when they could make a raft and trust themselves again to the current. It remains, then, said Dick Sand in conclusion, to decide if we shall descend the left bank where we are or the right bank of the river. Both, Mrs. Weldon, appear dangerous to me, and the natives are formidable. However, it seems as if we risk more on this bank because we have the fear of meeting Negoro's escort. Let us pass over to the other bank, replied Mrs. Weldon. Is it practicable? Observed Dick Sand. The road to the Congo's mouths is rather on the left bank as Negoro was following it. Never mind, we must not hesitate. But before crossing the river with you, Mrs. Weldon, I must know if we can descend it below the falls. That was prudent, and Dick Sand wished to put his project into execution on the instant. The river at this place was not more than 300 or 400 feet wide, and to cross it was easy for the young novice, accustomed to handling the oar. Mrs. Weldon, Jack, and Cousin Benedict would remain under Hercules's care till his return. These arrangements made, Dick Sand was going to set out when Mrs. Weldon said to him, "You do not fear being carried away by the falls, Dick?" "No, Mrs. Weldon. I shall cross 400 feet above, but on the other bank. I shall not land if I see the least danger. Take your gun. Yes, but do not be uneasy about me. Perhaps it would be better for us not to separate, Dick," added Mrs. Weldon as if urged by some presentiment. "No, let me go alone," replied Dick Sand. "I must act for the security of all. Before 1 hour I shall be back. Watch well, Hercules." On this reply the boat, unfastened, carried Dick Sand to the other side of the Zaire. Mrs. Weldon and Hercules, lying in the papyrus thickets, followed him with their eyes. Dick Sand soon reached the middle of the stream. The current, without being very strong, was a little accentuated there by the attraction of the falls. 400 feet below, the imposing roaring of the waters filled the space, and some spray, carried by the western wind, reached the young novice. He shuddered at the thought that the boat, if it had been less carefully watched during the last night, would have been lost over those cataracts that would only have restored dead bodies. But that was no longer to be feared, and at that moment the oar skilfully handled sufficed to maintain it in a direction a little oblique to the current. A quarter of an hour after, Dick Sand had reached the opposite shore and was preparing to spring on the bank. At that moment cries were heard, and 10 natives rushed on the mass of plants that still hid the boat. They were the cannibals from the lake village. For 8 days they had followed the right bank of the river. Under that thatch, which was torn by the stakes of their village, they had discovered the fugitives, that is to say, a sure prey for them, because the barrier of the falls would sooner or later oblige those unfortunate ones to land on one or the other side of the river. Dick Sand saw that he was lost, but he asked himself if the sacrifice of his life might not save his companions. Master of himself, standing in the front of the boat, his gun pointed, he held the cannibals in check. Meanwhile they snatched away the thatch, under which they expected to find other victims. When they saw that the young novice alone had fallen into their hands, they betrayed their disappointment by frightful cries. A boy of 15 among 10. But then one of those natives stood up, his arms stretched toward the left bank, and pointed to Mrs. Weldon and her companions, who, having seen all and not knowing what to do, had just climbed up the bank. Dick Sand, not even dreaming of himself, waited for an inspiration from heaven that might save them. The boat was going to be pushed out into the stream. The cannibals were going to cross the river. They did not budge before the gun aimed at them, knowing the effect of firearms. But one of them had seized the oar. He managed it like a man who knew how to use it, and the boat crossed the river obliquely. Soon it was not more than 100 feet from the left bank. "Flee!" cried Dick Sand to Mrs. Weldon. "Flee!" Neither Mrs. Weldon nor Hercules stirred. One would say that their feet were fastened to the ground. Flee! Besides, what good would it do? In less than an hour they would fall into the hands of the cannibals. Dick Sand understood it, but then that supreme inspiration which he asked from heaven was sent him. He saw the possibility of saving all those whom he loved by making the sacrifice of his own life. He did not hesitate to do it. "May God protect them," murmured he, "and in his infinite goodness may he have pity on me." At the same instant Dick Sand pointed his gun at the native who was steering the boat, and the oar, broken by a ball, flew into fragments. The cannibals gave a cry of terror. In fact, the boat, no longer directed by the oar, went with the stream. The current bore it along with increasing swiftness, and in a few moments it was only 100 feet from the falls. Mrs. Weldon and Hercules understood all. Dick Sand attempted to save them by precipitating the cannibals with himself into the abyss. Little Jack and his mother, kneeling on the bank, sent him a last farewell. Hercules's powerless hand was stretched out to him. At that moment the natives, wishing to gain the left bank by swimming, threw themselves out of the boat, which they capsized. Dick Sand had lost none of his coolness in the presence of the death which menaced him. A last thought then came to him. It was that this boat, even because it was floating keel upward, might serve to save him. In fact, two dangers were to be feared when Dick Sand should be going over the cataract: asphyxia by the water and asphyxia by the air. Now this overturned hull was like a box, in which he might perhaps keep his head out of the water, at the same time that he would be sheltered from the exterior air, which would certainly have stifled him in the rapidity of his fall. In these conditions, it seems that a man would have some chance of escaping the double asphyxia, even in descending the cataracts of a Niagara. Dick Sand saw all that like lightning. By a last instinct he clung to the seat which united the two sides of the boat, and, his head out of the water under the capsized hull, he felt the irresistible current carrying him away, and the almost perpendicular fall taking place. The boat sank into the abyss hollowed out by the waters at the foot of the cataract, and after plunging deep, returned to the surface of the river. Dick Sand, a good swimmer, understood that his safety now depended on the vigour of his arms. A quarter of an hour after he reached the left bank, and there found Mrs. Weldon, little Jack, and cousin Benedict, whom Hercules had led there in all haste. But already the cannibals had disappeared in the tumult of the waters. They, whom the capsized boat had not protected, had ceased to live even before reaching the last depths of the abyss, and their bodies were going to be torn to pieces on those sharp rocks on which the undercurrent of the stream dashed itself. Chapter 38. 2 days after the 20th of July, Mrs. Weldon and her companions met a caravan going toward Mboma at the mouth of the Congo. These were not slave merchants, but honest Portuguese traders who dealt in ivory. They made the fugitives welcome, and the latter part of the journey was accomplished under more agreeable conditions. The meeting with this caravan was really a blessing from heaven. Dick Sand would never have been able to descend the Zaire on a raft. From the falls of Entamo as far as Yelala, the stream was a succession of rapids and cataracts. Stanley counted 72, and no boat could undertake to pass them. It was at the mouth of the Congo that the intrepid traveller, 4 years later, fought the last of the 32 combats which he waged with the natives. Lower down in the cataracts of Mbilo, he escaped death by a miracle. On the 11th of August, Mrs. Weldon, Dick Sand, Jack, Hercules, and cousin Benedict arrived at Mboma. Messrs. Mottaviega and Harrison received them with generous hospitality. A steamer was about sailing for the Isthmus of Panama. Mrs. Weldon and her companions took passage in it, and happily reached the American coast. A dispatch sent to San Francisco informed Mr. Weldon of the unlooked-for return of his wife and his child. He had vainly searched for tidings of them at every place where he thought the Pilgrim might have been wrecked. Finally, on the 25th of August, the survivors of the shipwreck reached the capital of California. Ah, if old Tom and his companions had only been with them! What shall we say of Dick Sand and of Hercules? One became the son, the other the friend of the family. James Weldon knew how much he owed to the young novice, how much to the brave black. He was happy, and it was fortunate for him that Negoro had not reached him, for he would have paid the ransom of his wife and child with his whole fortune. He would have started for the African coast, and once there, who can tell to what dangers, to what treachery he would have been exposed? A single word about cousin Benedict. The very day of his arrival, the worthy savant, after having shaken hands with Mr. Weldon, shut himself up in his study and set to work, as if finishing a sentence interrupted. The day before, he meditated an enormous work on the Hexapodes Benedictus, one of the desiderata of entomological science. There, in his study, lined with insects, cousin Benedict's first action was to find a microscope and a pair of glasses. Great heaven! What a cry of despair he uttered the first time he used them to study the single specimen furnished by the African entomology. The Hexapodes Benedictus was not a hexapode, it was a common spider, and if it had but 6 legs instead of 8, it was simply because the 2 front legs were missing, and if they were missing these 2 legs, it was because in taking it, Hercules had unfortunately broken them off. Now, this mutilation reduced the pretended Hexapodes Benedictus to the condition of an invalid, and placed it in the most ordinary class of spiders, a fact which cousin Benedict's nearsightedness had prevented him from discovering sooner. It gave him a fit of sickness, from which, however, he happily recovered. 3 years after, little Jack was 8 years old, and Dick Sand made him repeat his lessons while working faithfully at his own studies. In fact, hardly was he at home when, realizing how ignorant he was, he had commenced to study with a kind of remorse, like a man who, for want of knowledge, finds himself unequal to his task. Yes, he often repeated, if on board of the Pilgrim I had known all that a sailor should know, what misfortunes we would have escaped. Thus spoke Dick Sand. At the age of 18 he finished with distinction his hydrographical studies, and honoured with a brevet by special favour, he took command of one of Mr. Weldon's vessels. See what the little orphan rescued on the beach at Sandy Hook had obtained by his work and conduct. He was, in spite of his youth, surrounded by the esteem, one might say the respect, of all who knew him, but his simplicity and modesty were so natural to him that he was not aware of it. He did not even suspect, although no one could attribute to him what are called brilliant exploits, that the firmness, courage, and fidelity displayed in so many trials had made of him a sort of hero. Meanwhile, one thought oppressed him. In his rare leisure hours he always dreamed of old Tom, of Bat, of Austin, and of Actaeon, and of the misfortune for which he held himself responsible. It was also a subject of real grief to Mrs. Weldon, the actual situation of her former companions in misery. Mr. Weldon, Dick Sand, and Hercules moved heaven and earth to find traces of them. Finally they succeeded, thanks to the correspondence which the rich shipowner had in different parts of the world. It was at Madagascar, where, however, slavery was soon to be abolished, that Tom and his companions had been sold. Dick Sand wished to consecrate his little savings to ransom them, but Mr. Weldon would not hear of it. One of his correspondents arranged the affair, and one day, the 15th of November, 1877, 4 blacks rang the bell of his house. They were old Tom, Bat, Actaeon, and Austin. The brave men, after escaping so many dangers, came near being stifled on that day by their delighted friends. Only poor Nan was missing from those whom the Pilgrim had thrown on the fatal coast of Africa. But the old servant could not be recalled to life, and neither could Dingo be restored to them. Certainly it was miraculous that these 2 alone had succumbed amid such adventures. It is unnecessary to say that on that occasion they had a festival at the house of the California merchant. The best toast, which all applauded, was that given by Mrs. Weldon to Dick Sand, to the captain at 15. The end of the voyage extraordinaire updated editions will replace the previous one. The old editions will be renamed, creating the works from print editions not protected by U.S. copyright law means that no one owns a United States copyright in these works, so the Foundation and you can copy and distribute it in the United States without permission and without paying copyright royalties. Special rules, set forth in the general terms of use part of this license, apply to copying and distributing project, and may not be used if you charge for an e-book, except by following the terms of the trademark license, including paying royalties for use copies of this e-book. Complying with the trademark license is very easy. You may use this e-book for nearly any purpose, such as creation of derivative works, reports, performances, and research. Project Gutenberg e-books may be modified and printed and given away. You may do practically anything in the United States with e-books not protected by U.S. copyright law. Redistribution is subject to the trademark license, especially commercial redistribution. Full license. Please read this before you distribute or use this work. Distribution of electronic works by using or distributing this work, or any other work associated in any way with the phrase Project Gutenberg. You agree to comply with all the terms of the full www. Gutenberg.org/license. Electronic works. Electronic work. You indicate that you have read, understand, agree to and accept all the terms of this license and intellectual property, trademark/copyright agreement. If you do not agree to abide by all the terms of this agreement, you must cease using and return or possession. If you paid a fee for obtaining a copy of or access to by the terms of this agreement, you may obtain a refund from the person or entity to whom you paid the fee as set forth in paragraph 1. 8. Used on or associated in any way with an electronic work by people who agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement. There are a few even without complying with the full terms of this agreement. See paragraph 1. See below. There are a lot of things you can do with Project Gutenberg electronic works if you follow the terms of this electronic works. See paragraph 1. Below. Foundation or PGLAF owns a compilation copyright in the collection. Works in the collection are in the public domain in the United States. If an individual work is unprotected by copyright law in the United States and you are located in the United States, we do not claim a right to prevent you from copying, distributing, performing, displaying, or creating derivative works based on the work as long as works in compliance with the terms of this agreement, for keeping the comply with the terms of this agreement by keeping this work in the you share it without charge with others. 1. D. The copyright laws of the place where you are located also govern what you can do with this work. Copyright laws in most countries are in a constant state of change. If you are outside the United States, check the laws of your country in addition to the terms of this agreement before downloading, copying, displaying, performing, distributing, or creating derivative works based on this work, or any representations concerning the copyright status of any work in any country other than the United States. 1. 1. The following sentence with active links to or other performed, viewed, copied, or distributed. This e-book is for the use of anyone anywhere in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away, or reuse it under the terms at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this e-book, derived from texts not protected by U.S. copyright law, does not contain a notice indicating that it is posted with permission of the copyright holder. The work can be copied and distributed to anyone in the United States without paying any fees or charges. If you are redistributing or providing access to a work with the phrase Project Gutenberg associated with or appearing on the work, you must comply either with the requirements of paragraphs 1, 1 through 1, 7 or trademark as set forth in paragraphs 1, 8 or 1, 9, with the permission of the copyright holder. Your use and distribution must comply with both paragraphs 1, 1 through 1, 7 and any additional terms imposed by the copyright holder. Additional terms posted with the permission of the copyright holder found at the beginning of this work. License terms from this work, or any files containing a part of this one. 5. Do not copy, display, perform, distribute, or redistribute this electronic work, or any part of this electronic work, without prominently displaying the sentence set forth in paragraph 1. 1 with active links or immediate access to the full terms of the Project Gutenberg license. 1(6). You may convert to and distribute this work in any binary, compressed, marked up, non-proprietary or proprietary form, including any word processing or hypertext form. However, if you provide access other than plain vanilla ASCII or other format used in the official www.gutenberg.org, you must at no additional cost, fee or expense to the user provide a copy, a means of exporting a copy, or a means of obtaining a copy upon request of the work in its original plain vanilla ASCII or other form. Any alternate format must include the 1, E7. Do not charge a fee for access to viewing displaying unless you comply with paragraph 1. E8 or 1. E9. 1. E8. You may charge a reasonable fee for copies of or provided that you pay a royalty fee of 20% of the gross profits you derive from you, already used to calculate your applicable taxes. The fee is owed agreed to donate royalties under this paragraph to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. Royalty payments must be paid within 60 days following each date on which you prepare, or are legally required to prepare, your periodic tax returns. Royalty payments should be clearly marked as such and sent to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation at the address specified in Literary Archive Foundation. You provide a full refund of any money paid by a user who notifies you in writing or by email within 30 days of receipt that he license. You must require such a user to return or destroy all copies of the works possessed in a physical medium and discontinue works you provide, in accordance with paragraph 1. F3. A full refund of any money paid for a work or a replacement copy if a defect in the electronic work is discovered and reported to you within 90 days of receipt of the work. You comply with all other terms of this agreement for free. 1E9. If you wish to charge a fee or distribute a Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work or group of works on different terms than are set forth in this agreement, you must obtain permission in writing forth in section 3 below. 1. Effort to identify, do copyright research on, transcribe and proofread works not protected by U.S. copyright law in creating the project electronic works, and the medium on which they may be stored may contain defects, such as but not limited to incomplete, inaccurate or corrupt data, transcription errors, a copyright or other intellectual property infringement, a defective or damaged disk or other medium, a computer virus or computer codes that damage or cannot be read by your equipment. 1. F2. Limited warranty, disclaimer of damages except for the right of replacement or refund described in paragraph 1. F3. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the owner of the Project Gutenberg trademark, and any other party distributing a Project Gutenberg trademark electronic work under this agreement, disclaim all liability to you for damages, costs and expenses, including legal fees. You agree that you have no remedies for negligence, strict liability, breach of warranty or breach of contract, except those provided in paragraph 1. F3. You agree that the foundation, the trademark owner, and any distributor under this agreement will not be liable to you for actual, direct, indirect, consequential, punitive or incidental damages, even if you give notice of the possibility of such damage. 1. F3. Limited right of replacement or refund if you discover a defect in this electronic work within 90 days of receiving it. You can receive a refund of the money, if any, you paid for it by sending a written explanation to the person you received the work from. If you received the work on a physical medium, you must return the medium with your written explanation. The person or entity that provided you with the defective work may elect to provide a replacement copy in lieu of a refund. If you received the work electronically, the person or entity providing it to you may choose to give you a second opportunity to receive the work electronically in lieu of a refund. If the second copy is also defective, you may demand a refund in writing without further opportunities to fix the problem. 1. F4. except for the limited right of replacement or refund set forth in paragraph 1. F3. This work is provided to you as is with no other warranties of any kind, express or implied, including but not limited to warranties of merchantability or fitness for any purpose. 1. F. 5. Some states do not allow disclaimers of certain implied warranties, or the exclusion or limitation of certain types of damages. If any disclaimer or limitation set forth in this agreement violates the law of the state applicable to this agreement, the agreement shall be interpreted to make the maximum disclaimer or limitation permitted by the applicable state law. The invalidity or unenforceability of any provision of this agreement shall not void the remaining provisions. 1. F. 6. Indemnity. You agree to indemnify and hold the foundation, the trademark owner, any agent or employee of the foundation, anyone accordance with this agreement, and any volunteers associated with the electronic works, harmless from all liability, costs and expenses, including legal fees, that arise directly or indirectly from any of the following which you do or cause to occur. A. Distribution of this defect you cause. Electronic works in formats readable by the widest variety of computers, including obsolete, old, middle-aged and new computers. It exists because of the efforts of hundreds of volunteers and donations from people in all walks of life. Volunteers and financial support to provide volunteers with the remain freely available for generations to come. In 2001, the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation was created to provide a secure archive foundation, and how your efforts and donations can help. See sections 3 and 4 and the Foundation information page at www.gutenberg.org. 501. C. 3. Educational corporation organized under the laws of the state of Mississippi and granted tax-exempt status by the Internal Revenue Service. The Foundation's EIN or Federal Tax Identification Archive Foundation are tax-deductible to the full extent permitted by U.S. federal laws and your state's laws. The Foundation's business office is located at 41 Watchung Plaza #516, Montclair NJ 07042 USA, +1 862 621 to 9288. Email contact links and up-to-date contact information can be found at the Foundation's website and official page at www.gutenberg.org/contact Literary Archive Foundation public support and donations to carry out its mission of increasing the number of public domain and licensed works that can be freely distributed in machine-readable form accessible by the widest array of equipment, including outdated equipment. Many small donations, $1 to $5,000, are particularly important to maintaining tax-exempt status with the IRS. The Foundation is committed to complying with the laws regulating charities and charitable donations in all 50 states of the United States. Compliance requirements are not uniform, and it takes a considerable effort, much paperwork and many fees to meet and keep up with these requirements. We do not solicit donations in locations where we have not received written confirmation of compliance. To send donations or determine the status of compliance for any particular state, visit www.gutenberg.org/donate. While we cannot and do not solicit contributions from states where we have not met the solicitation requirements, We know of no prohibition against accepting unsolicited donations from donors in such states who approach us with offers to donate. International donations are gratefully accepted, but we cannot make any statements concerning tax treatment of donations received from outside the United States. U.S. laws alone swamp our small staff. Methods and addresses. Donations are accepted in a number of other ways, including checks, online payments, and credit card donations. To donate, please visit www.gutenberg.org/donate. Professor Michael S. Hart was the originator of the Project Gutenberg concept of a library of electronic works that could be freely shared with anyone. For 40 years he produced and volunteer support editions, all of which are confirmed as not protected by copyright in the U.S. unless a copyright notice is included. Thus, we do not necessarily keep e-books in compliance with any particular paper edition. Most people start at our website, which has the main PG search facility, www.gutenberg.org, Archive Foundation, how to help produce our new e-books, and how to subscribe to our email newsletter to hear about new e-books.